Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Canon Fodder, brought to you by IronAgeArchive.com. Today, we're talking about books 10 and 11, aren't we, fellas? 10 and 11. And what snacks do we have today, Jeff?
Just the usual
Okay.
dehydrated fennel seeds. Pretty soon, though, I will get fresh fennel seeds from my backyard because it's about
Ooh.
that's that time of the year. So very excited.
Do you have any, fennel seed brand that you want to plug?
Uh, no, unfortunately, the only one that I enjoy is from China, so I don't want to plug it.
Oh, yeah, okay.
The Indian fennel seeds just don't do it for me.
Why wouldn't you? Why don't you want to plug a Chinese brand?
I don't know how deep their affiliation is with the Communist Party, so
Well, if they're from China, you can make a pretty strong guess. But pretty soon, we'll get Jeff's invasive fennel seed brand.
Brought to you by the People's Army.
Brought to you by the People's Republic of Canada.
Brought to you by the Saskatchewan Fennel Growers Association.
Oh, right. Yeah, my strain is actually fairly invasive. I see there's fennel plants growing along the street now.
Oh,
So-
wow, really?
Yeah.
In my neighborhood, we have an Asian berry called the wineberry. I think it's technically Japanese, but it's considered invasive. But gosh, do they make great snacking. Anyway, I'm going to do the overview of these books. The sleepless Greek brothers, Agamemnon and Menelaus, kept awake by their terrible anxiety, meet each other by the black ships. They devise a plan to send spies into the Trojan camp. Agamemnon goes to Nestor's tent and finds him awake. Together, they tour the wall and are delighted to find that none of their sentries are asleep. They call a small council of the major players and ask for volunteers for a spy mission. Diomedes is the first to volunteer. He picks Odysseus to accompany him. In the Trojan camp, Hector also proposes a spying mission. He asks for volunteers, and a rich kid named Dolon volunteers to set out and infiltrate the Greek camp. Diomedes and Odysseus, on their way to the Trojan camp, catch Dolon and squeeze him for intel. Dolon squeals, tells all, and begs to be spared in return for a generous ransom to be paid by his father. Odysseus assures him he'll be okay, but Diomedes roids out and cuts off Dolon's head mid-sentence. They sneak into the Trojan camp and, using information Dolon gave them, kill a bunch of Thracians and steal a really cool chariot. They ride back to the camp and the Greeks rejoice. That's Book 10, The Night Attack, or Doloneia.
Is it actually referred to as Dolonea?
In some translations it's Doloneia. Book 11, Achilles Takes Notice. On the morning of the next day, Zeus sends Strife down to the Greek camp. Strife casts Fury, which gives all the Greeks the bloodlust and a melee attack buff of +5. It's a little joke there for you kids. Agamemnon and his Greek army charge the Trojans. The Trojans charge back. They fight. And how? Agamemnon himself does a lot of the killing. This is his day. Hector looks on helplessly as Agamemnon and his Greeks slaughter Trojans effortlessly. Zeus sends a messenger to Hector, telling him to avoid the fray while Agamemnon is rampaging. He is to wait until Agamemnon is injured, then he can join in. Until then, keep jazzing the Troy boys to keep up the fight. Agamemnon gets stabbed, but he keeps fighting and killing Trojans. When the bleeding stops, the pain sets in, and Agamemnon is forced to withdraw. Hector enters the battle at that point, and the Trojans begin to turn the tide. Diomedes is able to stun Hector, but the Trojan prince pulls away and regains his composure. As Diomedes prepares to pursue him, Paris shoots him in the foot from hiding. At that time, Diomedes withdraws. The Greeks slowly begin to pull back, and Odysseus finds himself stranded, surrounded by Trojans. He does some impressive fighting until he gets stabbed real good, and Menelaus and Ajax come to his rescue. They then retreat. Paris shoots and wounds a Greek doctor, Mycenaean, who Nestor rescues and takes back to the Greek camp. As the wounded are coming into the Greek camp, Achilles thinks he sees Mycenaean coming into the camp and sends Patroclus down into the camp to find out if it is him and if he'll be alright. Patroclus and Nestor speak of Achilles' actions, or inactions, and Nestor speaks of his past. He suggests that Patroclus should get Achilles' armor and wear it in the next engagement, in hopes of severely demoralizing the Trojans. As Patroclus returns to Achilles' tent, he happens upon a comrade who was wounded in battle. He tends to his friend's wounds and laments the situation they are all in. So Rob, it's freshest in your mind. What did you think of Book 11 off the top?
Well, in terms of Achilles, I think he sees the inevitability of what's coming. But I said this last time, I'm impressed at the dramatic cues that push the story forward, and that Nestor, of all people, is the one to suggest to Patroclus to wear Achilles' armor. When on the one hand, it's a foolhardy thing to suggest, because Achilles, when he finally enters the fray, is going to attract the most attention. So if people think that Patroclus is Achilles, then he's going to draw down a lot of heat that he's not prepared for, obviously. But, and I hate going back to this, but destiny, it also drives the story forward. But I'm also, the other thing that I find incredibly refreshing about Book 11 is Agamemnon actually does something. He gets off his ass, and he's kicking ass too. And he's the king that I want him to be.
Yeah, if he just would have started off like this, I think Achilles would probably have to rejoin the fight because Agamemnon was getting all the glory.
Let me say this then, to put in with what I've just said. The reason I keep going back to the story and the structure of the story is, and I'm a little bit inspired by a video that I have Jeff McNukes to thank for sending this to me, is Jonathan Pajot's Universal History. And the other angle that I just came to me is Jung and the sort of archetypes, that there's a story here, and the way that the story unfolds, if you strip down its characters and you just wrote it out in sort of logical notation, that is an archetype of a structure of a story that is relevant to us as humans. And so the more we understand it as well, stripped away from names and of places, and if this story was happening in, like, West Side Story, the narrative of West Side Story is the narrative of Romeo and Juliet, like, explicitly. And if you boil down the narrative structure there's some truth about what it's like to be two young kids when your families hate each other and don't approve of each other. And if you can understand that, you unlock a little bit of the human experience. Theoretically, the statesmen of the First World War were the guys best prepared to prevent it. There were all these old guys who'd sat through the 19th century. They looked at the Schleswig-Holstein question. They looked at the cabinet wars of Bismarck. They knew the model, but somehow something changed, or in this moment, they weren't prepared for it. And so if you look at Nestor saying something, theoretically, Nestor's the one who should be giving the best advice. And yet here, it's remarkable that Nestor's the one who gives this piece of advice. And so I feel like I'm rambling now, but I'm getting at the underlying wisdom and structure of the story when I talk about this, when I talk about it from the abstract perspective of the narrative. And I think that unlocks a perspective for us going forward.
Well, and our dear friend Yasuke quite recently said, oftentimes you find more truth in fiction. And it's a chance for us to really examine narrative and the human condition through this stuff to better understand who we are and why we are.
I think these two books are both showing the depth of the story as well, and the depth of human beings and human decision makings. Like you bring up Nestor saying something out of his character. You bring up Achilles now all of a sudden worrying about people other than himself or his close immediate group of people that he's dealing with. And you see Agamemnon, you see everybody's arc changing in this, and that's a very human trait, a trait that can be related to, but it's a great way of showing character and depth of character in the stories. We're starting to see now the motivation of Achilles, who's all of a sudden spurned to action, whereas before he was so worried going home. He needed motivation of some kind. Of Agamemnon. Visiting Nestor in the night, trying to figure out what to do. He was looking for inspiration. And he found it through battle. And what a magnificent ability he ended up having.
Right. Yeah. And I think what you guys are getting at is kind of like, nobody exists as this kind of Platonic form of themselves. Everybody exists within scenes, within actions, and within things that take place in the real world. It's kind of like a co-creative process. So you're not just this like archetypal Agamemnon or archetypal Achilles. Everybody's an actual person. Their personhood and their personality is being co-created through the historical process, I guess.
Just to elaborate on that on further in character development and story arc, is Hector saying, yeah, if I do X, I'll get Y result. But that's not the case in this book. We're really starting to see the story arc of what these great men are capable of doing.
So, to contrast, we join Agamemnon at the beginning of book 10, unable to sleep because of his anxiety. He comes out of his tent and he meets with his brother, who's also suffering the same affliction. And they devise this plan to send spies into the Trojan camp because there's so much they don't know. They're desperate for any kind of information they can get. And so, this is the first time in this book that we see a clandestine operation, espionage.
When you say this book, you mean the Iliad, not this book.
Yes, yeah, the entire work of the Iliad. Yes, thank you.
I wonder if there isn't something of Agamemnon and Menelaus. If this isn't their conscience getting to them, if that isn't something that's going on at some level, like this is going badly.
I was like, oh, shit just got real. You know, they're surrounded by Trojans, huffing and blustering up until this point. They got thousands of their friends to sail across the ocean to fight somebody, and now they could all die here.
What had they been doing for the previous 9 years? I didn't. Why weren't there spy missions?
Raiding semi-defenseless towns.
Or even worse, and I don't even know if they've even considered this, but Agamemnon goes home empty-handed. Then what does that look like? How vulnerable does that make his position overall? Never mind just with the Trojans. He's got an entire kingdom to worry about.
Well, winning or losing, I quite enjoy Agamemnon's karma that he comes home to find. It's an enjoyable moment that happens obviously outside of the book. So no spoilers, but his wife kills him. And of all the people that deserve it, couldn't happen to a nicer guy, am I right?
Well, he did sacrifice his daughter
Right.
to get the wind into their sails. I mean, perhaps that's the only innocent person that he killed in this saga, but
There's a book that's recently come out by Tom Holland called Dominion. Tom Holland, he was working on the Roman Empire. And one of the things he came up against was he really found himself lacking sympathy for the Romans. And he decided to investigate this. What he came to the conclusion was, oh, they're not Christian. And even though he's an atheist, he admits, like, culturally, I'm a Christian. The difference, there is a profound and fundamental shift when the moment Christ gets up on the cross. And if you went to people and you showed them that story of Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter, it is absolutely, I couldn't imagine a worse thing. And I'm not even a dad. And we have two dads in the call who I'm sure the notion of sacrificing their child to accomplish their personal ends would be just about the worst thing they could imagine. So when we look at these guys, yeah, between them and the Romans, there's a lot of time, but the Romans would have understood this. The Romans kind of would have been like, oh, okay, just a few years later, a Roman that had come to Christ would have looked at that, like the people that Paul's writing to in the book of Romans. They would have looked at this, and 2,000 years later, they're much more similar to us. So yeah, time is something, but also, and if you're listening to this, odds are you're a cultural Christian, whether you like it or not. Sorry. And you hear the story of that, and you should be rightly disgusted by it. It's not that these events are difficult for anyone to identify with. No, we struggle with them because we have Christ, whether religiously or culturally.
How far do you think cultural Christianity extends? Does it also extend to non-Westerners?
Oh,
Extend to Asians?
I was going to go the other way, and I was going to make the argument that actually, like, in a way, the transgender movement is Christianity applied too far the other way. And I can't remember who's talked about this, but a few people have. I've come across it in a few places that they don't read the Bible, so they don't know the specifics put down, and so they have this idea of like, well, I'll let, yeah, if you want to mutilate yourself, well, okay, who am I to stop you? But they're missing the point, right? Because I think a big part of it is accepting the place and time that you're put into. Paul says, masters look after your slaves. I'm paraphrasing here. Masters look after your slaves. Slaves obey your masters. Which I take to kind of be like, if you find yourself in a situation, in this one, being a slave, accept it. If you find yourself in a situation where you're a man, part of that is accepting it.
I would say, to expand and then maybe answer that question, that cultural Christianity can extend everywhere because it addresses the individual. And for a lot of people, it may be a cultural transition. So like to the Asians, it will be a cultural transition. There's there's a different kind of acceptance there.
And to pick up on that, I would say it can be wildly successful because I would put it to you, Jeff, that that's what Hong Kong is. Hong Kong is China mixed with cultural Christianity. The values of Hong Kongers, and we pray for them every day, is their values are informed by English values who have come over and created, whether people like it or not, that synergy of Chinese values and Christian values in the form of English values have created one of the world's most successful economies if you let it run. If you're Winnie the Pooh, though, and you try and control it, you're going to struggle, I think.
I mean, there are certainly anti-capitalists who will present a different side to that debate, but that's probably a discussion for another time.
So is there something in this about knowing yourself, about understanding who you are and knowing your place? Isn't that kind of where we started with Achilles and Achilles' ability or inability to understand himself?
One thing that I'll say to that is that you can't really know yourself in that abstract sense. Where you learn about yourself is in scenes, in the situations. And there's this like Eastern religious concept of knowing yourself through internal kind of like meditation and internal like deconstruction. That's one of the things that I would argue against. Like you're knowing a certain aspect of yourself, but to truly know yourself, you have to actually live in the world.
Yeah. No one exists in a vacuum.
Yeah, toilet.
You're saying, yeah, I was going to say, you're saying publicly that Buddha was wrong, right?
I mean, Buddha was doing his own thing. He was exploring a different aspect of being human.
Mm.
That process he does miss this side that we're talking about. Maybe he was just a different, he's a unique individual, right? Maybe he had his own
Sure.
way of exploring. Maybe that was his way of being in a scene and finding himself.
That's kind of interesting too. How long did he sit under that tree?
A decade, was it? One of you said that to me a few days ago. So I only know that because someone said, yeah, he sat under there for a decade.
Sounds too concise to be toilet.
It was actually 49 days.
Oh,
okay. Well, that's fine. Yeah. Sorry, Buddha. I mean, I was ragging on you all this time.
I bet toilet could sit under there for a decade.
He's got nothing else to do.
With nobody else to shit on, how would he do it? Sorry, we could keep going. We keep going on hard. I'll probably cut this stuff.
I'll be amazed if toilet ever listens to this.
That's true. Yeah, he's got enough to do.
This is a little Easter
clearly.
egg for toilet if he ever finds it.
This will be behind the paywall.
We love you, but you drive us nuts.
Speaking of Book 10 and cultural Christianity and sort of this moving slider of cultural value, is there something to be said with that when Odysseus and Diomedes catch Dolon? Because Dolon is offering them, please don't kill me, I'll pay a ransom. And Odysseus says, don't worry about us killing you. That's which I read as essentially like that's not on the table. Whereas Diomedes is not necessarily after the information. That's what Odysseus is after. Once Odysseus gets that information, he flips the switch of like, I got you now. Why would I let you live and have to deal with you on the battlefield later? And he just cuts his head off right there. That's two different ways of dealing with a prisoner of war.
I can't help it. The thought that came to me when I read that was, no British officer would do this because the idea of parole developed, right? I think that's where we get the word parole for prisoners. If a gentleman gave his word that he would go home and he wouldn't pick up arms again, in the Napoleonic Wars, very often there weren't really prisoner of war camps. An officer, he would just go home and he'd say, sorry, I can't fight the French anymore. And so they'd send him off to fight the Spanish. So I mean, it's just I don't like it, obviously. It's not sporting.
It's not cricket.
I think what I saw there again was another mealy-mouthed representative of Troy, and maybe somebody that was maybe not Paris himself, but somebody maybe Paris would do the same thing. And I'm starting to see that the more and more we get into the book, the more and more apparent these characters keep showing up from Troy, and that there's certain amount of that in Agamemnon as well, and the Greek camp, but time and time again, these mealy-mouthed boys keep coming across men such as Diomedes and Odysseus, and they're just no match for what those two dudes can do. I mean, they're sneaking in. Who do they say? Who does Hector end up sending? He sends a mealy-mouthed version of a smaller version of his brother to do the attack in the night. And who do the Greeks? Who do the Greeks send?
You know why I think that it probably is all those guys are back in Greece. The Greeks didn't have to take those guys with them. Whereas, just like there's no women and children with the Greeks, but there are in Troy, the Trojans have a whole population to deal with. And okay, the young guys that the Greeks have brought along are probably under someone's keeping an eye on them. And if a young guy went, hey, send me out, probably the guy, they'd be like, no, dude, you're not ready. Sit down.
Speaking of like the rules of engagement and whether or not something is cricket, kind of debate that happens a lot on the dissident right, and when we try to fantasize about how we're supposed to deal with our enemies, whether or not honor is a strength or weakness. Playing this video game right now, Ghost of Tsushima. I'm not really playing it, but I've played a bit of it. And the beginning, the samurai protagonist refuses to sneak up on his enemies, and every confrontation has to be face to face because he plays by the set of rules and the invading Mongols don't. It becomes a huge disadvantage to him. In the game, you can kind of make the choice to give up this code of honor. It pretty much forces you to actually sneak around quite a bit in the game.
That is really interesting. So, as a backdrop, this is like, when did the Mongols invade? Like the 1200s?
Yeah.
So this is a little earlier than most of our viewers are used to, like the Warring States period. But the Mongols, you're saying, did not practice this code, right?
At least in the game. In the game, they're presented as just ruthless, sheer will to power.
Did they actually? They didn't. I thought they didn't even get into Japan.
They got as far as Tsushima and the next island over, and then they were stopped, I think.
Oh, the island, right.
The debate kind of rages on, what degree in war can you uphold honor?
Well, I'm sure you'll be, with the exception of the depiction of the Mongols in that case, you'll be treated sort of the way you treat people, more or less. And the second you stop treating people correctly, or Geneva Convention or whatever, all bets are off. I mean, the Japanese did it with the Americans in World War II. The Americans kind of stuck to the code for a little bit, and then the Japanese murdered a bunch of prisoners, and this is the South Pacific, murdered a bunch of prisoners and left their body in a dismembered heap, and then all bets were off. There was a little more quarter with the Germans until Battle of the Bulge era, when they started executing prisoners out of desperation. Then all bets were off. Tactically, there's a cold logic to what Diomedes did, because he is right. Like, I'll run into you in the future, and your dad is rich. So, you'll have better equipment, maybe you'll have more men. It just makes sense to do you right here. Whereas Odysseus, his cold logic is, I'm only after the information.
I'm glad Jeff mentioned this because this was something I had as well. And the first thing I could think of was this is a little tongue in cheek, but the great conflict of our time is between Antifa and the Proud Boys. And I have no respect for Antifa, but I think they're a bit sort of abrasive, but the Proud Boys are simple guys who they go out there and you know who they are, right? It's Antifa that's hiding behind masks and stuff like that. And Gavin McInnes, the founder, right? He's got a great phrase that he ends every show with: get fired, get in trouble, be brave, and never surrender. And there's much more of a sort of a warrior honor about the Proud Boys. Whereas I don't believe that the Proud Boys were like leading the forefront. There's a theory that Antifa caused January 6th, and that there were a few people there with like orange hats, And apparently the idea is that like Antifa were running around and wearing orange hats. So there's a few moments where people in orange hats pushing through and the rest of the crowd goes, oh yeah, okay, fine, let's go. And that's Antifa trying to create a situation in which the rest of where they get the mob going. And I don't believe that the Proud Boys would do anything like that, really. There's more honor on the Proud Boys side to their disadvantage. But I still think that's the point. The point is not to compromise to win, because if you turn yourself into a beast in order to win, what was the point of winning? You either win the right way or you come through the other side beaten, but as a monument to your cause.
There's a sense of martyrdom there that I think we have to better understand. And martyrdom, and then being, what utility do your actions serve, first of all, and then who do they serve? Does your martyrdom serve your own cause, or does your martyrdom serve the cause of your enemies? And I think that's something that you're always tactically weighing when you're doing things, when you're being a provocateur or a dissident. And you have to understand the situation. And the only way you can understand the situation is to be in it. To do, as you said, to get dirty, get your hands dirty, get in the mess of things, and really understand what's going on before you can even make these value judgments. And then you take a step forward and see what happens. I don't know if anybody considers honor, or Diomedes considers honor, or his version of honor. He saw somebody there in a point of weakness and he took advantage of it. And to him, that served his purpose and utility. But was there an opportunity for that young man to become a martyr for his side? I don't know. I don't think so. It doesn't appear to be that he had any strength. But if Diomedes killed somebody of higher stature in the middle of the night and slit his throat as a spy, maybe there would be more motivation. And I think we're gonna see that martyrdom throughout the rest of the book.
And that goes to what I said about viewing this through the lens of Christianity. Our honor is really chivalry, which is to be strong, but to have a code of morality behind it. Whereas Diomedes and everybody else in the Iliad's honor is to be strong. It is just strength.
Well, it's the sacrifice of the innocent as well, and how important that is. It's can be utility, but there's other. That's a very important theme of who's innocent and who's guilty, because we all could be sacrificed, but there is only one person who is truly innocent and was sacrificed, and that's the most powerful.
That's interesting. Troy as a type of Christ, a flawed type of Christ. The innocent Trojans who have nothing to do with Paris showing up with Helen, finding themselves being sacrificed.
Yeah, because in a lot of ways, the modern pop culture take on the story of Troy is that it's a tragedy, right? That great city had to fall, tricked into letting the Greeks in, right?
The movie has Helen, this sort of almost liberation aspect to Helen. It's, you can look at the story of Helen running off in two ways. One is she's a harlot who's broken her marriage vows
And left a daughter.
Right. Yeah, I always forget that. She's a good time woman, right?
She's the antiquity Michaela Peterson.
We'll need interpretation on that.
Sorry, don't let me stop you. Yeah, go ahead.
Or she's this strong woman, spelt with a Y, WMYN.
And probably 2 X's.
Womenix.
Check it out. She ends up with Orlando Bloom.
Yeah. What's the guy's name? Who's Menelaus in?
Oh, it's that like that. No, I think he's an Irish actor. He's
Brendan Gleeson.
Yeah.
Who looks very familiar to me in some cases. And I would make the argument of gingerism on Helen's behalf in the movie.
That's why she left him.
I would pick Brendan Gleeson over Orlando Bloom, especially in the Bronze Age world. Brendan Gleeson could look after me a lot better. And, I could, feel safe in those big arms.
But Helen doesn't think like that. Helen's looking for the luxury of Troy and the pretty-haired version of what could be possible. And she sees security maybe in the behind the walls of Troy rather than Menelaus, who knows what he's going to do. He's a crazy ginger. He could try and take down the walls of Troy, or maybe he just has a shortened life because he's so aggressive, and he's not into sitting around and playing the harp and reading all day. He's a man of action, and his family is equally as aggressive.
They all want the fuck boy until it's time to eat.
And hot take, Helen has daddy issues. Because Zeus comes along and basically rapes her mother, disappears, and isn't she like born out of an egg or something? She like actually like gestates in an egg.
That I do not know.
But it's like going to a strip club and seeing a woman up there and going like, what did her dad do wrong? Well, he was the father of the gods and he raped her mother and then he fucked off back to Mount Olympus. That's what he did wrong.
Absent father.
From Zeus's perspective, though, it's like he's never really absent, right? He's the father. He's the god, right?
It's like Santa Claus raped your mother.
In the cheesy what's his name? Kevin the Hercules. Kevin
Sorbo.
Sorbo.
In the cheesy Kevin Sorbo Hercules, right? Zeus is always showing up and Achilles is like, come on, Dad, will you do something about Hera? And he's like, well, women, son. It's like he's just this like, oh well, Hera's gonna do what Hera's gonna do. And it's just like, come on, Zeus, will you man up?
Okay, sorry. That was we're steering away from Diomedes stabbing a bunch of guys who are asleep. Yeah, so I don't know that there's much else I wanted to cover in book 10. Diomedes essentially sneaks into a group of like a slumber party and starts stabbing people in their sleep. And then they steal a really cool chariot and two really nice white horses and ride away. And then the only thing I have left to talk about is a question for you guys, because when Diomedes and Odysseus get back, they have to clean off. They dip into the ocean, which has to be really refreshing because it's the Aegean. Then, after washing and covering themselves liberally with olive oil, they sat down to eat. So, my question is, have you ever covered yourself in olive oil? And is this a thing?
I loved ice cream as a kid. And I really I still like ice cream. And one day I realized we had ice cream in the fridge and I pulled the chair over and stood on top of it to get to the freezer. And I opened the freezer and I pulled the ice cream out and I was like 5. And I was so happy to have the ice cream that instead of eating it, I took all my clothes off and rubbed the ice cream all over my body.
What the?
And to this day, my mom has this picture on the fridge of a naked 5-year-old me, arms stretched out wide, incredibly pleased with himself that he had made himself ice cream. I loved ice cream so much that I wanted to become ice cream.
What is the logic? I mean, granted, you're 5 years old, but like, what is the logic of instead of ingesting it slowly and savoring it, why would you want to put it all over your body?
Love makes you do irrational things, Cinder.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, you're going with the flow, man. You're in the moment of ice cream. You're not thinking about the consequences. You're just letting it all hang loose, man.
I'll accept any of those things. It's the waste of ice cream that really starts to hurt my feelings.
Yeah, but I imagine the olive oil keeps the mosquitoes away or something like that. Maybe.
Well, I read it and I was just like, that's your only, like, they didn't have lotion, right? Or anything like that. So it would make sense.
Salt water dries out your skin more, doesn't
Yeah, it does.
It's like the $3,000 business suit, right?
it?
Like these guys got to look good. They got to moisturize. They got to go into the boardroom next week and they got to lay down some plans and they got to look good.
They do have a hostile takeover of Troy in the works.
They have a hostile takeover of Troy and they need their skin moisturized. That's the way it is. And they look after themselves. These guys work hard. And to me, this is what it's all about. This is after a hard day's work of slaughtering your enemy, of taking a plan from your king and acting the plan and being victorious. This is what it's all about. This is what the warm bath at the end after your victory. You know, you've survived without a scratch on you, and you're there having a warm bath, basking in your glow. All those trials and tribulations, the past 9 years, the arguing, the motivating, the subterfuge. It's all worth it because you've won this. You've won that day, and there's another day tomorrow. But today you've won. You can relax. You've turned the tides of history. You've done your job for that day. To me, that's a pretty endearing passage. Line 440 is, but
Well, I think I'm going to try it. And I encourage you guys to try it too at some point. The paywalled episode 24 of Canon Fodder will be Greco-Roman wrestling with all the hosts covered in olive oil.
And if you're wondering what we're going to do after the Iliad, it'll be Monday Night Raw.
Might be interesting though if we explored the themes of Monday Night Raw, going over the canon of WWE.
you can tie this into the Iliad as these are our
Sure.
contemporary warriors, right? Like these are the guys that they're really too big and too athletic to do anything else. Like you're not going to shove those guys into a cubicle and have them file HR form. You know what? These guys are wired a different way, and they're genetically built a different way. And maybe you can equate that back to somebody like Odysseus or Diomedes, in that these men are shoehorned into these professions at this time, whereas before they would have been great warriors.
And you think about what they were playing out, they were representing honor culture or warrior culture and warrior spirit and different aspects of that, playing out these same debates that we have today.
So moving into Agamemnon, he hears the call from Strife, who incidentally was the one who threw the golden apple to Paris. But now here she is again to offer her services in whipping up the Greeks to go mad. And among them, as we all know, Agamemnon suits up and leads the charge, which to date he hasn't done. And going back to Jeff's point about the archetype, this is an example of a changing archetype where so far Agamemnon has been like this boasting bag of wind who's sort of just kind of hung back and let his fighters do all the fighting and would not stop singing his own praises. But finally he becomes the warlord we always wanted him to be, and he kills a lot of people in this. The end.
In sports, sometimes commentators like to say that today this guy showed true character.
And even in the book, it says Agamemnon was the first to charge in and killed the Trojan Baenor, and after him, his comrade, the charioteer Oileus. Oileus had leapt down from the chariot to oppose him, but as he moved into the attack, Agamemnon stabbed him in the forehead with his spear. The bronze helmet failed to stop the spear, and it pierced both the metal and the bone, and spattered all the inside of the helmet with his brains. Did you guys get a different translation of that? I'm wondering how many translations talk about the spattering of the brains.
I think I had that too, yeah.
There was one, what stuck out to me in this one, and it was book 11 at some point. So it says like that someone freaks out. And I was like, oh, I have to mention that to Cinder. Like, who's, do you know what I'm talking about?
A couple of sentences that were worded in such a way that it was like it could have been written yesterday.
And oh my God, he totally.
Yeah, it was super flippant.
Literally?
He literally cut his arms off. Oh, but that moves. We could go into Agamemnon and we'll flip back and forth. But there's an interesting part in here that shows one of the Trojan higher ups who, in hoping to get some bribes of gold from Paris, dissuaded the Trojans from returning Helen to Menelaus.
Yeah.
But now his two sons on the battlefield met up with this rampaging Agamemnon, and they plead with him to take us alive, and you will get a ransom that will be well worth it. Antimachus, the greedy politician, our father is rich. Agamemnon says, if you two are the sons of warlike Antimachus, you should act like it. You shall now pay for your father's disgraceful insult. And he hit one of the brothers in the chest with his spear, knocked him on the ground, stabbing him on the ground. And then his brother leapt down, and Agamemnon slashed off his arms and his head, and then rolled him through the crowd like a log. And these are the sons of a man who encouraged the Trojans not to return Helen. And this is yet another example of young men dying for old men's greed. And we've gone over it before, so it's nothing new, nothing interesting. But this, to me, was the most visceral example that I've come across.
Yeah, it stood out to me too. There's something poetic about it, wasn't there? Their dad sort of signs their own death warrant. Not that I think Agamemnon would have let them live if anyway.
Well, and they certainly weren't brave. Maybe they were in this army because they had to be, or because their dad said, "Well, you have to be in the army. I'm trying to make moves in the Trojan court. Like I can't have two cowards for sons."
Again, I think they're a representation of Troy. They never had to fight. And here they're up against Agamemnon at his peak. He's all of a sudden turned it on, and now not only is he looking for a fight and he's got the taste of blood, he's going to now insult the elites of Troy by turning this guy into a hot dog and rolling him through in front of everybody else. Like, this is the impact that Agamemnon's going to be able to have by killing these guys. Right? It's the utility of their death is going to be served quite well because they spoke up about who they were and how brutally they died. You're not just going to stab them and let them stagger off. No, this guy did something wrong. This is what we can do to you. We can get to your sons. We can mutilate them. That's a pretty big statement. So if they'd have shut their mouths, maybe ran the other way, knew what they were good at, not having any experience, apparently. It doesn't sound like they put up much of a fight, and Agamemnon had their way with both of them. So again, I think it speaks a lot to Troy, the mindset of Troy itself, of arrogance and weakness.
These two boys, these brothers, before they even started fighting with Agamemnon, once they got in his proximity, begged to be taken prisoner. And later, because it's Agamemnon's day, he's stabbed in the side and he takes out the spear and keeps fighting. And only after the wound stops bleeding and the pain starts does he withdraw. So this is a special, unique kind of king. But to Laurentian's point quickly, further highlighting the mealy-mouthed weakness of the Trojans, when Diomedes knocks Hector back after meeting him in the middle, Paris steps out from hiding, aims his bow, and hits Diomedes when he's stripping a body. He shoots him in the foot. The arrow goes straight through his foot into the ground. So Diomedes is trapped. And what does Paris do? He jumps out from cover, presenting himself, and says, "Got you. I didn't shoot for nothing. I only wish I had hit you in the belly and killed you. Then the Trojans, who tremble at you like bleeding goats at a lion, would have some respite from their trouble." And he easily could have just notched another arrow and shot him. But instead, he's going to be a little bitch.
And I love Diomedes' response, like, "Come at me like a real man." Where you just sit there messing with your hair.
Yeah, this is the line. Typical archer, loudmouth, all hairstyle and bedroom eyes. But then, yeah, Diomedes does rip the arrow out of his foot and leave the battlefield.
I think this book makes an interesting point about, and maybe this is Homer's personal view, or I don't know, or maybe just the view in general of Greek people at the time, but they have this kind of negative view towards men of Troy and the way that they fight. Like, they have this negative view towards sons of rich Trojan politicians end up paying for their lives or dying in some very dishonorable fashion. And they also have this negative view of people like fighters like Paris, who just kind of snipe from behind cover and don't fight like real men.
But I also think there's something about the guys who've actually come with the Greeks. They're a much more military-oriented group. They're there to fight. And the Trojans, it's a little unfair to represent them as sort of weak or dilettantish.
Yeah.
When, these guys didn't, as I said, these guys didn't ask Paris to show up with Helen.
Later on in history, all warfare is actually conducted this way. Archers, sniping, rich men, politicking.
Yeah, if it hadn't been for archers.
It's kind of like shows like a degeneration from the Greek point of view.
Could you have anybody other than Paris coming out of Troy and these two boys as representative out of Troy? Like, obviously there's people like Hector and other great warriors, but they're not as highlighted in this battle. Their deeds are of these weak young men, and that's a result of the high walls that they've built in their luxury and their inability to understand anything beyond money and just the low value of their transaction that they're trying to make. They're trying to buy their life. They're not showing any honor, and it's they just don't know how, and they don't know how because they've never had to. They've been able to hide behind walls and live in luxury.
This is city boys versus farm boys.
farm boys who've been selected out of a group, as Bucklander says, who've selected out of a group. These are the best of the best, and they've stuck it out for 9 years. Like, these aren't the structures that these people come from. It dictates the way of battle. It dictates how they fight. It dictates who they fight. And it also dictates their negotiation when they're faced with death. I'll pay you money. Well, I'm going to kill you anyway. There's no negotiating that. You're done.
Now I agree with Diomedes. When I imagine Dolon as a hipster, I get what he was going for.
Well, this is the majors, and you don't pull your punches in the major league. And there's, as much as I find it distasteful, there is a raw brute force logic about it. Yeah, of course I'm going to kill you. What did you think I was going to do? And not only that, but like the time for you buying your freedom back from me is over. We're not playing that game anymore. Those days are gone. This is total war. We talked about this a few times. This is total war.
If I don't have any negotiating tactic, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not going back behind those walls, my wife and family tonight. Like, I'm here for keeps. Like, we're playing under totally different rules because I'm here to get behind your wall and take your wife. And you're not playing to keep her. You're playing to keep yourself.
The Trojans may have lost this war. What does it say that modern warfare nowadays is more conducted in the Trojan way of war rather than the Greek way of war? Nowadays, warfare, when they talk about third and fourth generation warfare, the US military actually has a meme research division. And there's all of this, like China hacking this server and the US hacking that server. It's like international espionage. There's very little actual like meeting face to face on the battlefield and saying, you're my enemy.
Well, I mean, they literally have a meme research division.
Well, they did put some millions of dollars into research.
I mean, but it's 100% rational because memes are psychology, and if you're going to do psychological warfare, that makes sense.
What Paris is doing to Diomedes is a form of psychological warfare, as he's pinned him to the ground with an arrow, and then he is making fun of him. And he's probably putting a little lisp in his voice to sound even more infuriating to Diomedes. That's a form, I mean, he's aggravating the guy. Luckily, Diomedes just brushes it off.
And I think Agamemnon's version of psychological warfare is a lot more effective, right? Like, Paris was trying to keep up with Agamemnon's display of power and control, and Agamemnon won that battle.
Also, there's this element that you guys are talking about negotiations. That's a huge portion of what international warfare looks like nowadays.
Yeah, that's true.
It's like signing all of these treaties and saying, "Oh, if you don't hack this server, we won't hack you here." Or you got one of our spies. Oh, we got one of your spies. Let's trade.
So one of the debates that there's a sort of quote about is war politics or is politics war? Karl von Clausewitz said, "War is a continuation of politics by other means." This sort of spectrum of one end of diplomacy and on the other end war, it makes you wonder, is there a nice line anyway there, or is it just slowly catchy monkey?
Well, Ernst Younger talked about, I believe in one of his books, I'm not a very good student of Ernst Younger, but I'll bring it up anyway because I heard it this week, about how his version of war, when he got into World War I, he found there was no honor in pulling a trigger of a gun, that the warrior had completely changed, that it was now you were an operator of the machine, or the machine was operating you. And that made the appeal of war and the honor of war very different than what he was imagining when he was a child or before he got into the war. Was that now they were stuck in trenches in World War I, waiting for some machine to be developed that they could get out of the trenches and go and kill their enemy. They were no longer swinging swords. There weren't even horses in World War II.
I wonder if that isn't just all young men's deflationary encounter with war, or whether there really was ever a glorious period to fight wars. But I think about it, war no longer rewards our classical stereotype of a warrior. Let me put it to you this way. Ajax would have made a terrible special forces soldier because he's gigantic. Big guys do not make good special forces soldiers. Guys that excel are these short little guys who are stronger in a power to weight ratio than the big guys are, even though they're not as strong in absolute terms. It's a bit, your bubble can't help but be burst when a 5-foot Vietnamese girl who's had 3 days training on an AK-47 can, if she gets lucky, take down a U.S. Marine Ranger from 100 yards away because she's lying in the jungle waiting for him to come along. Like, that's a rude awakening. When what you want it to be is, the shield wall, and there you are beside your brothers, and there's no hiding. You're just going straight at them, like, or you're a knight, right? This is what guys think about when they think about the glory of war. Well, that was gone with the Napoleonic Wars. The Crimean War, the first major war fought after the Napoleonic Wars, Crimean War between basically France and Britain on behalf of Turkey against Russia, was already starting to become this industrialized war. So I think even if your Ernst Jünger had been born in time for that war, he still would have been a bit deflated by that experience.
It's the development of it of now where you've got drones flying into a building and blowing somebody up. Like there's nothing but dishonor now in war when you're seeing that, and the chaos that ensues. Whereas maybe in the past, maybe in the classical, in a more warrior defined era, there could be more peace because these warriors were better understood their role and they better understood how to negotiate.
Well, it's also true that it takes. I'm really bad with sources lately. The psychological impact of shooting someone from 100 yards away is not the same as getting up close and stabbing them in the guts. These guys have a better understanding of the realities of war. It's a First World War guy talked about this. Is the difference between shooting at someone from a trench and then getting up close and bayoneting him, that was sort of a rude awakening for him.
I also got this imagery because in the game Ghost of Tsushima, you can challenge opponents to one-on-one showdowns. And so you present your katana, and the opponent brings out his like Mongol or axe. You guys like stare each other down. Then when you were up the 3-year-old Vietnamese girl or whatever, what was it? Like nowadays, when you challenge your opponent to one-on-one battles, you get like these Afghan farmers or Vietnamese teenagers showing up. You guys like lock your weapons. One of the things that people talk about in the modern age is like there's a leveling. Technology has sort of leveled us to the point where there are no like distinctions between. There's no like skilled warrior class anymore. Oh, just anybody who can pick up a gun.
All you need to do is be strong enough to control a firearm, and then the skills that those guys have. And I'm not in any way knocking the skill that they have, but it's not about strength really. It's about the ability to go walk over the Hindu Kush and don't eat for 3 days and don't sleep for 2 nights, and then be able to fire that weapon with the same standard you would. That's a skill. I have a lot of respect for them. Well, let me put it this way. Laurentian and I were built for Viking raids, not modern warfare.
I was built to have a rich father and try and barter my way out of espionage capture.
What about modern warfare? What's beyond the special forces guys? And I think something that we are starting just to even understand is that warfare now isn't, or politics isn't being fought literally, it's being fought virtually. We see the crumbling of democracy, or we see the crumbling of the public sphere of debate, and all that's left is most of the discourse happens by non-professionals on Twitter.
200-300 years from now, there's going to be another podcast that talks about how the warriors of our age were so glorious and skillful.
Those guys didn't live in their pods. Can you believe what life would be like outside a pod?
What frustrates me about not modern warfare, but the modern sort of political engagement is that, going back to Antifa and Proud Boys, is that the right shows up and they go, okay, what's the game? And the left says, well, it's this. And the right goes, okay, fair enough, let's go. And the left goes, but before we begin, you have to tie your hands behind your back, but we can do anything we want. And that's what frustrates me, that the right is allowing that. Maxine Waters can get up there and talk about, like, go get him, Antifa. but Donald Trump tells the Proud Boys to stand by, and that's somehow like the same thing. If or it's worse, they're allowed to define things, which is what I find frustrating. They're allowed to define the Proud Boys as neo-Nazis, which couldn't be further from the truth, right? There's loads and loads of Proud Boys that are not white, that are gay, that are black.
Also, the Proud Boys is an invention of like what, the last 5 years?
Yeah.
Antifa has been around since like the 20s. So this is an organization with a track record, and the Proud Boys is just a bunch of, and I use this loosely, a bunch of retards who like drinking and punching.
But they're better at it than Antifa.
Well, of course, because they like punching. Because Antifa doesn't like punching. Antifa likes bike locks when you're not looking, and they like to burn your business down, and they like to gang up on you and sucker punch a 65-year-old man when he's looking the other way. Like those are Trojan tactics.
I couldn't agree more with you, Cinder. But the logic of where you're going, it's scary because if Antifa gets their street gangs from the 1920s, well, I want the free companies. I want, Ernst Röhm on the streets with his revolver.
Right.
That's the scary conclusion, and that's where I don't want to go.
The left plays to power, the right plays to rules. So when the right shows up to a fist fight and they say, what are the rules? The left understands that as, well, we have the power and they'll dictate the rules. So until we understand what power is, and until we understand that we need to dictate the rules, we will forever be locked into our paradigm of punching from behind.
So to a certain extent, in book 10, Odysseus is the old paradigm and Diomedes is the new paradigm.
I think that's the hook.
I think so too. I mean, I would go further and say that the end of this book is the beginning of the end for Patroclus, because this is where Nestor suggests you don the armor. And so in subsequent episodes, we will be addressing what changed, what truly is the turning point in this book.
Although I guess in Odysseus' defense was a great epic written about him later, because there wasn't one about Diomedes. There's a line in the movie where Brad Pitt says, "That's why no one will remember your name." Maybe Odysseus did the lame, honorable, old paradigm thing, but in the long run, it was worth it.
Well, I was thinking about this, that of all the heroes that an intelligent person can name from the Iliad, Ajax, Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Paris, Diomedes is a workhorse who probably doesn't get the recognition that he deserves in terms of how we remember him, because he really, up until now, he has been driving a lot of events, and you have to have recently read the Iliad, or at least know it pretty well and really enjoyed it to remember Diomedes, which is, kind of a shame for his sake.
He was the man of action, right? He had no political skills. It was just who's going to do. Well, Diomedes will do it, and Diomedes plays to that. He knows who he is, and he's going to do it every time. Every time he's called, who's going to go in the trenches, at night. He says Diomedes is going to do it. Odysseus will go with him, but Diomedes is going to do it. He's the first guy.
Well, there's something about the workhorse. Yeah, there's a lot to admire there. Then the man who's both a skilled fighter and a skilled, I don't want to say politician, but skilled statesman.
Well, I think he was a man's man. He was a great coach, because there was a couple times when they were all feeling low and he was like, "Get it up, boys. Let's roll." And he was also the first to volunteer for this spy mission. And as we go back, you'll see lots of speeches, rah-rahs from Diomedes. So workhorse in that, he's always down to work. Like, let's go to work, sharpen your spears and let's go to work. He's never talked about getting on the boats and going home.
It goes back to, that's why no one will remember your name. Never had that.
Yeah, because you're doing all the work. you're killing everybody. You're not promoting yourself. You're killing everybody.
He doesn't have a lot of dimension. There's no turn for him, Like we see Agamemnon, we see him, as someone we don't like, and suddenly does something that we do like, and that changes. That gives him dimension. Same with Achilles. He's got this whole history of being this excellent warrior, and he has a point with his argument in the beginning, but then slowly the events start to change and change our perspective. So he has a growth, and we'll see more of that as he goes further. And Odysseus is always pretty cool headed, but he's always making interesting decisions. So he's got dimension. But this Diomedes is He's got 0 and he's got 60, and those are the only 2 speeds he has.
And I'm trying to think of in wrestling who is Diomedes.
Oh, it's the jobber, isn't it?
Well,
Which jobber had a really good winning record?
Is he Kane, like the big guy who doesn't speak? Like there's no.
he's Kevin Hart, but he's Kevin
Oh.
Hart in the NWO. Or wait, no,
Kevin Nash.
Kevin Nash, yeah.
Kevin Nash, big
Right.
sexy. He's not really that interesting, but he's part of the group. You can't have an NWO.
He was the leader of the wolf pack, right? He did have a good arc at the end.
By the way, in the next episode, I'll be changing my name from Bucklander to Big Sexy.
He also was in Magic Mike. Thought I'd bring that up.
I never saw that. I heard it was good.
Yeah, no, don't put that in either, please.
I got it on Laserdisc up here. And
We know what Agamemnon makes Laurentian watch at night.
do we want to do our final thoughts, gentlemen?
Someone else go. I want to riff.
Well, I really enjoyed Book 11. It struck me, and I don't know if this was just the Rowe translation, but it struck me as very loose but tight in a way that it just felt very natural, human, relatable, even though it's about murder and violence. And I wonder if that part of that is because there's nobody I'm really against doing what they do. Everybody's in character, including Agamemnon, who has left his lofty throne and is swinging a mace and throwing a spear with the good old boys. So far, I think Book 11 is my favorite. I know that's not much for a closing thought, but
And the danger with that is that the last book you read is going to be your favorite.
I think today's discussion and the books in general bring up a lot of important questions for us in our times, especially if we're going to engage in politics, right? Questions about how to deal with your enemies outside of pure total warfare and violence. A lot of those questions, it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning. You can talk abstractly about how the proper way to do these things are. Until we're actually in the moment, we don't really know, I guess. They are things to think about, especially as someone, I consider myself fairly new to political engagement. I wasn't really that involved in 6 or 7 years ago. I'm especially new to Christianity. And I know that Christianity has its own ideas about loving your enemy and praying for your enemy and forgiveness. So these are big questions that have been weighing on a lot of people, I think.
Overall, the story arc on this one of all the characters is the most interesting. You see the development and I didn't expect Agamemnon to join the fight. I expected Diomedes and Nestor and Odysseus to do what they did for the most part. But Agamemnon showing up, and even Paris and some of the Trojan quote unquote warriors, or the Trojan boys, they kind of played their part.
the Troy boys.
Spelled with an I, right?
Yeah, well, of course.
The Troy boys, the Orlando Blooms played their part. So we see some of the same things being played, but we see some new games being played and some new strategies being tried. So we see the ability for these guys to learn, particularly Agamemnon is learning. And we see also something that wasn't spoken about a lot was Achilles being brought in again. And for whatever reason, he's been aloof to this point. I think aloof is the right description. Something has piqued his interest. Somebody or something has piqued his interest as to get him interested in the Greek army again. And I expect to see him back, and I expect to see him take his mantle up further. But what is it about Agamemnon? It must have been Agamemnon's action, because he was the key representative in this story, the key antagonist. Well, what was it that appealed to Achilles to make him maybe not change his mind, but to at least get some interest into what was now happening with the Greeks? Because he's looking at things now and trying to figure out what's going on.
I just want to interject really quick there, because the reading that I got was Achilles and Agamemnon are feuding. They're essentially rivals in their little microcosm. What's worse for a rival than to see your other rival succeeding? And in a great way, and in a way that you can do and possibly better. What's worse than seeing an old girlfriend that you had an issue with a hot new dude? And I don't know, if you're Laurentian, Magic Mike making another movie without you.
I was gonna say, if you're Laurentian, seeing the cow that got away.
Achilles he has to hear that Agamemnon's out there killing it. And so that's going to bring him out of his tent, which is the first we see, because he's usually sulking in his tent. And now he's out watching the battle. So the interest has pulled him in, and he's trying to play it cool, but he is sending Patroclus down to, yeah, go check on that guy. I like that guy. Go down there and, just kind of figure out and maybe ask some questions, and I'll pick your brain because I'm not coming out of my tent. But now he's starting to show an interest because not only was Agamemnon doing really well, there was also a dire situation developing because even though the Greeks were out there killing, they did get pushed back. They did a lot of great things. All the guys were out there, but it wasn't enough. They were able to get kind of far, but where they just needed that one little push, which is Achilles.
Something about this also reminds me of right-wing content creators who always talk about trying to quit Twitter. It's like, yeah, I'm done with Twitters. Like, screw how they've treated me. I'm done with all this drama. 2 weeks later, they're like, well, guys, I gave it a try, but I'm back on Twitter. It's like they just can't look away. Like something in the warrior nature or whatever field that you're very much engaged in, like something within your nature always calls you that you can never fully detach from.
If you're going to fight a battle, you're going to have to be in it. And you're not going to know what you're going to do. You're not going to know what your opponent is going to do until you're in the battle. Nobody's in a battle right now. We're finding out where the grounds are going to be. We don't even have an army. The army we know will likely be virtual army in the wars to come. It's not going to be, technology's developed to the point where we can hit a keystroke and kill each other virtually. We don't need to kill each other on a battlefield.
If Achilles was truly done, he would have sailed already.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
I was just thinking, the meme of, Daddy, what did you do in the 2016 meme war? I said this last week at the end that there's a storm brewing, and you can feel that at the end of book, what was it, 9, and you can feel that at the end of book 10. I am afraid of the consequences of what the coming storm for us personally is going to be, but I certainly think that there is one coming. The new normal is never being able to relax. It's constantly keeping you on your toes. It's constantly lurching from one thing to another. And it's about getting us to look to the state to solve these problems. But the new normal is debating about Brexit. What's going to happen with Brexit? What about men who want to use a woman's bathroom? What about women who want to use a men's bathroom? What about a guy who wants to lift as a woman in the Olympics? The rest of our lives, we're going to have the specter of the coronavirus hanging over us. I mean, don't kid yourselves. This is the new normal. The new normal is not just about coronavirus. If I'm going to have my back against the wall and say what the coming storm really is, all these stuff that we've been in through, my gut tells me that this is the low pressure feeling when you're outside and you know the storm's coming. And those summer storms, you're sitting outside and you just kind of know that there's a storm coming. My fear is that our fate is similar to that of Troy's. And that sounds like a black pill, but I want to take a white pill here. I want to reference again, I can't recommend it enough, Jonathan Pajot's discussion with Jonathan Rowland on the universal history. Troy's fate is sealed. This is something I've said, this is the Bucklander position. We can't get out of what's coming. It's going to happen to us. What we have to do is prepare. We have to get the ark ready because these are the days of Noah, as far as I can tell. The good news is I am optimistic that people who are listening to this and agree with this, it's our descendants, physical and intellectually, that are going to be the ones that survive. And that's what happens with Troy. Troy forms Rome, and Rome comes back and conquers Greece pretty handily. And I think this isn't so much about the Iliad, it's about where we are, but I'm bracing for impact over my lifetime. Troy endures. And even though we remember the Greeks, the Trojans are the ones that have the last laugh. And I think that we're a bit like the Trojans, right? We have our women and children with us. Whereas Antifa, they don't have anything they don't bring anything they care about with them. The thing to keep in mind is this, and this is Romans 5. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom also we have access by faith into his grace wherein we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. And hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given unto us. For when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. I have hope for the future, and if not in this world, in the next, for my hope is in Christ.
Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Please do check out ironagearchive.com, join the conversation. Make sure you comment below, even if it's just a bunch of random letters and alphanumerics, because it helps the algorithm.
Be strong, get a farm, get some cows, and milk them.